Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So I'll just give a brief introduction of Dr. Dasgupta. Actually, when I tried to pen certain things about Dr. Dasgupta, as a person who I'm admired as a journalist for a long time, I didn't know how to introduce him as such. So I thought of introducing him like this way. So it was 11 September 1893 when Swami Vivekananda was in Chicago, and he gave that brilliant and impressive speech, probably for the first time introducing the philosophy of Hinduism to the English-speaking world. And roughly 100 years later, it was another Bengali who became very vocal and became a vocal exponent of a conservative ideology and strove for reaching out to a cohesive English-speaking audience through his columns. Dr. Dasgupta is a member of parliament from Rajya Sabha. His columns, which appears on English dailies like the Times of India and the Telegraph, are a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the Indian right. He is an alumnus of the prestigious Oxford University and an author of the book Awakening Bharat Mata. Dr. Dasgupta was awarded Padma Bhushan in 2015 for his contribution to literature and education. Dr. Dasgupta, thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show. At first, you performed your dharma effectively in your karma bhumi. Is it too soon to actually expect you back in your janma bhumi?
No, I spend a lot of time in Kolkata and in West Bengal these days, but it's been a bit disrupted because of the lockdown and the COVID. But I'm quite a regular person there. I've still maintained very, very deep connections. I maintain a house there, and I'm there very, very often. So it's not that I'm in any sense detached from Bengal in any way. So I think in sometimes, the idea of what is a karma bhumi and janma bhumi sometimes collapse into one, and let's see how it goes. But as you well know, that there has been over the years a tendency of people to migrate out of Bengal for reasons which I need not elaborate at present. But as you get older, I think you are drawn back to your Janmabhoomi.
So my question to you, sir, at first I would like to just ask you to put your opening remarks and tell us what is conservatism is all about and why do you choose to be conservative? And we have seen very less number of textbooks or literature has been written in the context of Indian conservatism. And why is that?
Okay, thank you, Ratnadeep, for giving me this opportunity of talking to organization which has got such an interesting name, Honest Critique. I don't know whether critiques these days tend to be honest or not, but anyway, I think the endeavor to be above the normal rules of partisanship is commendable. I think what Mr. Pramanick in his introduction spoke about, I think slightly mistakenly spoke about conservatism as an ideology. I think I would first correct that. I don't think it's an ideology. I think it's an approach. It's a way you look at things. It's not necessary, when you talk about ideology, you often have something which is fixated in stone, which is something which is dogmatic, it stems out of dogma, which is inflexible. I don't think any of these apply to what is conservatism. There is, for example, there are conservative parties, but when you talk about conservatism, you talk about really an attitude, you talk about approaches. And there's another thing which I think is very, very important to talk about. You're talking about experiences. And therefore, as I'll explain to you, conservatism is not something which you can codify. And I think that's very, very important in today's world to understand that there are aspects of human life which is not possible to codify. So if I was to define what I think are the essentials of conservatism insofar as it applies to the political realm, I would start off with four sort of essential attributes. The first one is this never-ending tussle which we've often seen between the individual and the community. Now, today, most of the constitution makers, lawyers, everyone, etc., have this view that it is the individual which is at the core, and it's at really the foundational core of political systems, of nations, of everything. Constitutions, for example, are written with the idea that you must empower the individual, you must concede him or her various rights, entitlements, etc. But the community, which is a far greater thing, which talks about a sense of community beliefs, community wisdom, is something which is not often documented so far by at least political scientists. They may be spoken about by anthropologists, they may be to some extent spoken about by sociologists, but certainly not in the realm of political thing. And the importance of this lies in the world of experience. And I think Edmund Burke, who sometimes is often referred to as the father or the founder of modern conservatism, had a very nice way of putting it. And he said, human experiences cannot that only a very small fraction of human experience is actually codified and written. A lot of it is basically unwritten and based on experiences. And a lot of human experiences which are not codified are often called prejudices. And I think one of the features which conservatism suffers from in the popular parlance is that it is often equated with rigidity and it is equated with prejudices. But prejudices itself is born of a lot of human experience. It's something which is transmitted from generation to generation, and it acquires a certain sanctity in certain groups of people. This is particularly true as far as agricultural communities are concerned, rural communities are concerned, as to why certain things are there. I mean, for example, a lot of rural people would say when a particular bird flies or makes a noise, that signifies that it's going to rain. Or when dogs bark at a particular time, does it signify an earthquake? Now, we've all heard such things, and each of us who've been to rural communities would have experienced such a thing. Now, very little of this can be scientifically verifiable, but it's born out of particular experiences of people over the generations which have been passed down. Likewise, we often make, and I think here this is a more negative feature of what might be called prejudices, we often tend to make big generalizations about collective attributes of people. We say a Bengali is such and such, a Marwari is such and such, a UP person is such and such, a Punjabi is such and such. Each one of us have their own ways of making these sort of things. How do these come about? How do these come about is that certain experiences over the years has come and seeped into the soul. And today we'd say, let's not make generalizations. And I think that's fine. It's not possible to always make generalizations. But at the same time, each one of us do make these generalizations. We make these generalizations in every way, even if we don't express them particularly. In our understanding of human beings, we tend to make national generalizations, we make regional generalizations, we make area-specific generalizations, we make all sorts of generalizations. So the idea, therefore, is, do we dismiss all of them as being of no consequence whatsoever and reduce it to the question of the individual? Now the question is, conservatives certainly believe that while the individual is important, it is the community and the collective which also has a greater importance. So that's the first one. The second important feature of conservatism is that it is national in its orientation. We've heard about communists who have a certain Marxists, who have a certain internationalist outlook. They often, in the olden days, in the 1930s, 20s, there used to be something called the Communist International, where they all tried to unite their forces, have a similar outlook, more or less march to the same mental tune. There is no such thing as a conservative international. There cannot be. It's an oxymoron. The conservative is either national or it is nothing. We have a very rich tradition of, for example, British conservatism, which is founded on the idea of what they call the ancient constitution, which is again a derivative of common law. We have an American conservatism, which is very central, which is centered on the original American Constitution. And they have a certain view of what that conservatism means. That the complete supremacy of the individual over any form of state. That's the basis on which the American conservatism is concerned. There is something very rich tradition of Japanese conservatism, which many people may not be familiar with. And that, again, is, for instance, Shinzo Abe, the outgoing prime minister of Japan, always proudly called himself a Japanese conservative. And the Japanese notion of what is conservatism in the past was exclusively centered on the sanctity and the divinity, in some cases, of the emperor. But later it's come round to, it's been viewed as how the idea of the greatness of Japan, the term beautiful Japan, for example, which is a very much a literal translation of some of Abe's words, is there. So the nation is very much a part of the national identity, is very much a part of conservatism. Now, in the context of India, let me just say a couple of things. And I'll come across into this as the third point, which is really why it's, and it's linked to this question of why the importance of the nation. It is the belief, and this is very, very important, and I think this is what really distinguishes conservatives from a lot of the others. It is the belief that the nation is sacred. The sanctity of the nation, a certain sense of divinity of the nation, is very much central to the idea of conservatism. And this, again, you will find it, in France, they have a notion of Madeleine. In Britain, you have Britannia. And in India, for example, a lot of people these days have taken objection to the use of Bharat Mata, for example. Now, Bharat Mata is a relatively modern concept, as opposed to Bharatvarsh. Bharatvarsh, you can trace the idea of Bharatvarsh as some form of a sacred geography which existed, and you can find in enough passages right from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and including some of the Vedic chants, which actually talk about the idea of what constitutes the geographical parameters of Bharatvarsh. You also have the notion of how the despite never having a single state, the notion of Bharatvarsh often permeated right over in terms of how the pilgrimage routes were centered, in how people looked at what is sacred, etc. For instance, if you take again the case of Bengal, you will find that for the Bengalis, one of the most sacred places used to be, first, it was always Kashi, Banaras. Second, it was always Jagannath Puri. And third, it was also Kamakhya. And it stretched further. If you looked at where the Shankaracharya made his peaks, they covered the four corners of the. So the idea of sacred was also inbuilt into this notion of what constitutes India. Now, what the change which took place in the post-colonial, in the battle against colonialism, was how the notion of Bharat Mata was introduced into this whole thing. The founding idea of Bharat Mata actually came from yet another Bengali, and that was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. When he wrote Vande Mataram, which was probably an add-on to his original novel, Anandamad, he conceptualized Durga as representing Bharat, the land. Tuham Durga Dashapraharani. It's there in black and white. The verses these days are no longer sung because of reasons of political correctness, but in terms of when Vande Mataram was constructed in his mind, it was very clear that it was Durga, which was the thing about it. Now, from there, the transition to Bharat Mata was only logical. It actually took the imagination of Sri Aurobindo. The popularization of Vande Mataram was really the work of Sri Aurobindo. Bankim Chandra wrote it, but it was Aurobindo who popularized it. And from there, in the iconography of Indian nationalism, Bharat Mata took a very important role. Now, different people conceived of Bharat Mata in different ways. Bankim Chandra conceived of it as Durga. There are others. Today, if you see more popular calendar art representations of what is Bharat Mata, you will find Shakti, a mother goddess perched on a lion with a map of India. This is a rather vague constructed map of India in a lion. And variations of that same theme. Abanindranath Thakur drew a slightly different version of Bharat Mata. It's also quite an interesting intervention. It's never really cottoned on. The idea of Bharat Mata, which is central to the idea of Indian nationalism, and you'll find it throughout. There's something which is a continuum, right from the time around the 1900s, right to the time of independence, and subsequently it has, and what united both the moderate stream, the extremist stream, with the Gandhian stream, with the revolutionary stream, was this notion of Bharat Mata. They were united on that particular issue. So the idea of the nation as sacred and national identity playing a very, very important role was a central feature of Indian conservatism. The final feature which I'm talking about is a little more contentious. It's the notion of what constitutes the state. And here I come back to this larger question of, the individual, the community, etc. Now, this is very much a Western construct. There are those who say that one of the features of conservatism is a limited state. And subsequently, with the growth of Thatcherism in particular, this has been identified as the minimal state. Now, there is no real definition of what constitutes a minimal, there is no actual unanimity as to whether the state should be minimal or whether it should be a more intrusive apparatus. There are, for instance, philosophers, conservative philosophers like Roger Scruton, for instance, who believe that the state is something which is sacred. He has a sort of Hobbesian view of the state as a protector. And he said the state cannot have a transactional view with its citizens. And therefore, by not having a transactional view, what he is suggesting is that it is not for conservatives to get involved in economics. And I think this is one of the big schisms and dividing lines of today, where you have something where people talk about the cultural right and the economic right. You might have heard it, because the term conservatism is often very simplistically equated with the right. Now, here the notion of economics plays a very, very important role, because when we're talking about the state today, essentially what we are talking about, not so much whether the state has certain law and order, sort of a coercive apparatus. What we are talking about, what is the role that the state plays in regulating the economy? Does it, or does it leave it to this institution called the market? And here I would say there is no fundamental agreement on this score, and different people have the different approaches to this subject, and it is sometimes marked by a massive degree of flexibility on this. So, for instance, Western conservatives by and large prefer a deregulated form, whereas the Eastern varieties often see that the state should play a greater role, and that you must mold the state to fulfill the task of the nation. So that's a different approach altogether. Now, and this sort of division, this sort of debate also marks a lot of the discussions on what is conservatism in India. And you'll find this is a subject in which there is very little unanimity, and often free marketeers, for example, and there are a few free marketeers in India, or people who are more inclined towards market economics, they will say, for instance, that the BJP is not really a conservative party. They are a statist party. And this has often been a subject of pretty intense discussion. So this issue of the cultural right versus the economic right, some people would say that the Swatantra Party was the only party which really was the party of the economic right in India. But it's interesting to note that, well, the Swatantra Party, Raja Gopalachari, who's the founder of the Swatantra Party, one of his main critique of Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1950s, where apart from his rejection of the idea of cooperative farming, which he thought was going to bring in a measure of socialist collectivization in India, I think he was a bit alarmist in that respect. He also had this thing that the idea of dharma in India, the codes of morality which govern citizens, that has been eroded by the Congress's approach to constitution, to life, to the planning, everything. So he had this own idea of what should make the community more viable and a factor in Indian politics again. So it's not exactly true to say that the Swatantra Party was exclusively a party of a pure right. So I would say let these be the sort of initial remarks. You told me to spend 15 minutes on it, so I think I've more or less I don't want to exceed the time, because I would rather people ask me questions, or any questions which stem from this. So over to you to ask questions.
Thank you, sir, for summarizing it so beautifully and precisely. And I apologize for my way of defining.
You don't have to apologize.
portraying.
It's not a question of apology. It's just
Actually, many of them actually apprehend that conservatism is actually a political idea. It was really beautiful, sir. Sir, so I would like to go ahead with the next question, which I often find many people asking. So, in India, we don't have a correct alternative for the term conservatism. Like we have for communism, we call it Samyavad, we call liberalism Udarvad, and many other, which has been accepted as a academic, uh, term where they call it communism, they call it Samyavad, and capitalism, Samantvad, terms like that. But in case of conservatism, we don't have any kind of shorthands or things which we can call in the Indian languages. So, sir, do you think in a way this actually challenges the concept of or the essence of conservatism, and which do not actually gets encapsulated in any term? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And when I was writing the forward to this book, the introduction to this book, a rather long introduction, if I may say so, I grappled with this question as to what exactly is there a term for conservatism in India? And I consulted a large number of people from all spectrums of the ideological framework, and all of them were agreed, look, this is not something we have often seen things which are in opposition to the other, but we don't have anything which is talking about conservatism. So conservatism in that sense doesn't have an equivalent in any of the Indian languages. And one of the reasons for it, I did ponder about it. The reason for it is the basis on which Indian conservatism is structured is based on this notion of what is called the Sanatan Dharma, which is, if you want to translate, it's the eternal way. It doesn't mean it's the unchanging way, but it means that there is this large element of continuity which marks Indian civilization. And I think continuity is really taken as one of the hallmarks of Indian civilization. So maybe it's for that. I'm not saying that I have an answer, but does that mean that the basic features of what can be called conservatism that doesn't exist in India? I think all of you who are familiar with the robust political debates in this country would certainly recognize very many of the issues which come about are not based on sheer only political differences. It comes about because people have very, very different outlooks on their life. It's not merely a question of their different voting preferences. That would be a very simple issue. It's based on a far larger issue, schism. They look upon the whole world in very, very different prisms. And for a very long time, it was not fashionable to be a conservative at one time. And again, in India, the term conservatism is often misled. So who is a liberal and who is a conservative? In my book, I've given the example, of two very important stalwarts of what is called the Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century. One was the towering figure of Ishwarchandra Vidyashankar, and the other was the more controversial figure called Radhakant Dev of Shobha Bajaj. Now, the difference between the two lay on the question of widow remarriage. Vidyashankar was in favor of it, very strongly in favor of it, argued very strongly in favor of it, and Radhakant Dev argued against it. What is interesting are two things. One, Ishwarchandra Vidyashankar based his entire critique of the institution of of the prohibition on widow marriage, his institution of widow remarriage, was based on the Shastras. It was not based on rationalism. It was not based on human rights. It was based that the Shastras said that there is no bar on a widow to remarry. So did, for the matter, Radhakantadev. Radhakantadev had another thing, and this later came in when the age of consent was being discussed in Maharashtra, for example, and there was a big debate between the reformists of Pune and Lokmanya Tilak. There the question came that, yes, maybe the age of consent should be raised. But then they asked the question, who is the colonial state to decide this? And again, Radhakantadev, let's get back, was one of the most foremost exponents of women's education in India, in Bengal at least. He devoted a lot of his energies, resources, time, etc. to ensuring that women get an education. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, on the other hand, was very cutter when it came to who should get admission in Sanskrit college. Should it be enlarged to beyond the Brahmins? At that time, only Brahmins and Buddhis were allowed thing. Then the question came up, should caste be allowed? Then the question is, should the Subarnabonik community be allowed? And he had strong objections to that. So who is the conservative? Who is the liberal? This is the dilemma when you use those sort of yardsticks in assessing people, to saying who is that. And I would say that there is in every conservatism a liberal. And in every liberal in India, there is a strong element of conservatism.
So this is something which I picked up from your initial remarks and something which you have mentioned in your book as well. According to many, the idea of India is limited to what is enshrined in the constitution, and somewhat the year 1950 was considered the year zero as such. So in this context, how is conservatism linked to the idea of nationhood? And what is the major difference between a conservative nationalism and constitutional patriotism?
Yeah, it's a very contemporary. It's a question that's has a big degree of contemporary resonance. Now you see, the idea of constitutional patriotism is something which is borrowed directly from Germany. It's an idea which one of its most famous exponents is a person called Jürgen Habermas, a very eminent, slightly abstruse philosopher. Now, the reason why Germany, the year zero was something which they decided was 1945. Why 1945? That was the year Germany came out of after a devastating and, if I may say, a very shameful defeat. And Germans at that time, for them it was not merely a question of a defeat, but an embarrassment with its own history. So they wanted something where they wanted to extricate themselves from their own history and start afresh. And they saw the new constitution, which was framed, I think, in 1948 or so, as being the hallmark of a new beginning. And subsequently, that idea of Germany has been enlarged to include Europe, and a very benign, slightly, Europe which is blessed with entitlements and rights and all those sort of things. A lot of codification, the European Union, which has become a part of the German sense of what constitutes Germany. Now in India, when the constitution which was enacted in 1950, was no doubt a very, very important document. It's a document which tells us the rules of the game, as I call it, how public life should be conducted. And it's very important because you need to have those rules of the game if you're not going to get completely whale into a state of anarchy. But the assumption that India began in 1950, to my mind, is completely wrong. India did not begin in 1950. There is a huge prehistory to India. And the constitution covers only what I call the rules of public life. It does not cover, and no constitution can cover, no written document can cover the impulses of nationhood which have shaped what our present existence is. So therefore, what I'm saying is that the constitution has its importance. It has a certain juridical importance. It has a very importance in terms of defining what are rights, entitlements, all those sort of things. But in terms of defining who we are as a country, as a nation, its role is limited. Because that's decided by that inheritance which goes right behind. It could, 1950 is only a blip as far as that is concerned. It's a far greater expanse which we are talking about. And that's the reason why I have often said that constitutional patriotism is a very limited idea when it comes to India. And if we are talking about nationhood, we're something far, far greater and far more cultural.
Yeah. So, sir, the next thing that I want to ask you is, you've written in your book about Savarkar, and with the recent debate around Savarkar that's been heated debates around Savarkar, it's something which I picked up from your book. You describe Savarkar as an archetypal Hindu nationalist, a self-professed rationalist, equally at ease with both the West and the East. And then you have went on to define how he has distinguished between the Hindu and the Hindutva in that way. So, in this context, can you just give us a brief of what, who the personality of and how the personality of Savarkar actually defined the idea of Hindutva? And you have mentioned some in the book as well that he was not the first person who advocated that idea. It was there by even Bankim Chandra did that before him.
See, if you were to again look at the translation, what does Hindutva mean? Hindutva, the best translation is not Hinduism. It's got nothing to do with it. It's got nothing to do with religion. It's got nothing to do with ceremonies, how you perform your pujas or what are your rituals and things like that. It's the nearest approximation I have found to Hindutva is Hinduness. It means it's the collective experience of someone of being a Hindu. And that can be political, that can be cultural, that can be various things. It embraces, and Savarkar was very clear in his mind that there is a very strong distinction between what is called Hinduism. He says you're free to practice whether you're a Shaivite, whether you're a Vaishnavite, whether you're a Shakta, or whether you're a Nastik. You can be anything. The theological issues which are there within this entire gamut is not the issue. It's your experience as Hindus, which is called the entire history, the memory, the culture. And again, that was what he had in mind when he spoke about Hindutva originally. But then I think Savarkar made a cardinal error. Savarkar tried to codify Hindutva. He says, and when he came to this question of India is not only your Pitrabhumi, it is also your Punya Bhumi. He tried to codify it and said that is what a Hindu is. Those who regards Bharatvarsh as not only your Pitrabhumi, but your Punya Bhumi. And that's what got him into this sort of thing, a muddle. Because in a sense, everybody said, okay, we consider in India, Bharatvarsh to be our Pitribhumi. But then the notion of Punya Bhumi excludes a lot of people. Or some people who don't even have an idea of Punya Bhumi. But if Savarkar had thought of it as saying that you consider India to be sacred rather than a Punya Bhumi, he might have been a little more deaf. But in trying to codify it, he sought a position of exclusion. Then he tried to cover it up by saying, no, I don't necessarily mean that anybody who is not a Hindu will be deprived of their civic rights. He said civic rights belongs to everybody. But I will not consider them to be Indian. Now, he had this, they asked him a question of, what do you think of Sister Nivedita? Here is one person who was the most militant in terms of her articulation of what might be called Hindutva. And Savarkar sort of said, no, I'm sorry. She cannot fit that description. So I would say that Savarkar, in trying to make a political intervention in the 1930s and 1940s, actually went outside his own initial definition of what constitutes, of what the feeling of Hindutva is, which is a far more cultural thing. And I would argue very, very strongly that there are certain things which should never be defined. The moment you start defining them, an emotion, Hindutva is more an emotion. Bhavna, as they call it. The moment you start trying to codify it, defining it, saying it must have 1, 2, 3, 4, you get into all sorts of trouble. And as far as I'm concerned, Hindutva is a sentiment which incorporates the entire experience, the civilizational experience of India.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is, sir, in the last 6 years, do you think there has been an upsurge of conservatism or what we call right wing in India, and there has been a retraction of the Nehruvian consensus, what the left liberals talk about in Indian politics?
Yes, there has been, whether I would call it a right wing or not, but certainly you see Nehru's pillar was founded, Nehru's entire construction, his ideological construction was based on 3 pillars. The most, one was secularism, which he interpreted it in a particular way. The other was socialism. And third was non-alignment. 2 of these pillars came crashing down after 1989 when the Berlin Wall collapsed and the Soviet Union disintegrated. Socialism became increasingly a discredited idea. The idea of non-alignment, while it remained on paper, there was a non-aligned movement, etc. But in reality, the same premises which governed the Cold War was no longer there. So it was left with only one pillar, secularism. And a lot of the fights since then have been on those who want to not turn India into a Hindu country, but who would like the idea of secularism to be moved from being a purely juridical construct to having a cultural content as well. And that was the reason. And some people have called that majoritarianism. Some people have called it something else. I mean, the labels you can attach to it. But I'll give you an interesting example. In his intervention in Ayodhya on the occasion of the Bhumi Puja, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke of the temple in Ayodhya as a symbol of modern India. Now, what did he mean? Was he referring to the fact that it was a so-called birthplace of Ram? Was he referring to the fact that it was a temple which is being constructed by the sanction of the stamp of a Supreme Court of India, etc.? What I think he was talking about was that there were certain missing elements in Indian secularism which didn't take into account the transition, the whole passage right from antiquity and connect it to modernity. Edmund Burke once said that life is really a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. And I think this is very important in trying to understand these sort of things. You brought about history, you brought about culture, all of these gets linked in one way. Of course, not a lot of people, their approach to their attack on secularism is based on the fact that, oh, you're being too charitable towards the minorities. That's one way of looking at it. I find it a very oversimplified approach. No doubt, there is in political terms, there is a case for saying, why should there be varying, why should there be different forms of social codes, etc. We can have that debate over and over again. And that you can't have one law for the majority and one special exemption for minorities. Those are sort of, they would say that's a form of a differentiated state which should not exist. Now, those are issues which are there. But at the end of the day, the old Nehruvian idea of what constituted secularism, as he underlined, which is a tremendous degree of accommodation, a special accommodation towards minorities, and a policy of non-intervention as far as the minorities are concerned, but a policy of actual intervention as far as the other communities are concerned, in terms of their rituals, in terms of their social life, etc. Those double standards would be. So the idea of secularism in India, in my view, is undergoing a remarkable change. It doesn't make India an intolerant place. What it does is it takes into account certain other impulses which have so far not been accommodated by Nehru's vision.
Yeah. So, sir, in the recent few years, as the previous question was about a change in the political sphere or the landscape we have seen, is it fair to say the Ram Janmabhoomi movement is a facet of the revival of conservatism in India, which was suppressed for a long time? Can that particular incident be one of those?
No, it's not. No, it's not. I don't think the Ram Janmabhoomi movement had anything to do with it. In a lot of ways, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was a radical movement. It broke a certain stereotype of the passive Hindu. And that was a departure from earlier. It led to a degree of assertion as far as Hindus are concerned. When Swami Vivekananda spoke about the need for the entire nation to march to the same, for all hearts to beat to the same spiritual, talked about a common spiritual heartbeat. What he had was an aspiration, but that was never the truth. Because in real life, as he spoke about, he said, it's the patient Hindu, the meek Hindu, the divided Hindu, which is the reality. What the Ram Janmabhoomi movement did was that it actually created something which was far more political. It created the idea of a political Hindu, which had not been in existence prior to that. So that was, to my mind, a very big departure from what had existed earlier. That was probably what also made it very exciting. I don't think a lot of people saw it in that way. The critiques of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement focused somewhat on that, but they were mainly concerned about what is the historiography, etc., all those sort of issues. But the form of what the mobilization threw up I don't think was addressed promptly. And I think the mobilization threw up in any way, which is why when finally the Bhumi Pujan was done 2 months ago, there was such a lot of quiet jubilation in Hindus, including people who hadn't participated in the movement, who had certain misgivings over the violence, who had certain misgivings over the demolition. They also got it, finally. And I think that's why it's not really a conservative movement. I thought it was a radical movement, which has ended up creating a political Hindu in India.
So the next question is, can it be said that the idea of liberalism is in a way a integral part of conservatism? Because from your book, you have mentioned in one place that consequently, apart from fascists who remain committed to radical ruptures, the traditional right has acted on the belief that a living society can only change healthily when it changes naturally. That is in accordance with its acquired and inherited character and at a given rate. Unquote.
Yeah. Look, I think what liberalism in India at least tried to do was that it didn't want to acknowledge these inherited characteristics. It sought to create a modern India which was based on a mirror image of what we are not, but only very few people of us were. It didn't take that into account. The conservative assertion in India was really a movement for recovery, an acknowledgement that these are also part of the stream, the entire part of the Indian mainstream. An acknowledgement of that and a recovery of those traditions which had not been so. But so far as the rights and entitlements of people are concerned, there is a commonality which marks Indians from, all conservatives and liberals together. The issue is not really the constitution. The issue is the question of nation. So there is a convergence, but there is also a divergence. But I don't think any of the conservatives and those who want to overthrow the state are basically either from the radical left or from the extreme right. The middle ground is basically comprises of both conservatives and liberals.
Okay, sir. So the last question for the session before we enter into the audience questions who are putting their questions in the chat box. So the common perception among the university and college students, many of them, most of them, is that the left is on the intellectual side and the right works on emotions and lacks substance in their thought process. How can we change this perception and bring more scholarly work in the right, or is there actually a need for this?
That observation of yours is absolutely correct. But again, let me say this is not an observation which is Indian specific, India specific. It's an observation which has existed for a long time and all over the world. The Conservative Party in the United Kingdom and in Australia, for example, used to always be called the stupid party. They were always thought to be people who never had that intellectual gravitas. They lacked the ability for abstraction. And I think one of the things which Burke often talks about is that, it's what defines a conservative is that they are not prone to abstraction, that they give a greater degree to experience and emotion. And I think that's completely correct. But there is an entire body of literature. And I think one of the problems which in India and the curriculum is that the whole body of conservative literature which exists, which is both Indian in character, and Western is not really accommodated in any way. I think one of the biggest shortcomings which we've had in India is that the genesis of Indian thought, the pre-existing wisdom, the inherited wisdom which we have, indigenous wisdom, has often not been properly studied and analyzed. This is a problem, and I think I also suffer from that in a way, because I'm approaching the whole question essentially through a Western prism. The manner in which, for instance, Sanskrit is taught in this country is a scandal. It's taught as if you're teaching Sanskrit to the bloody Purohits. Your training ground for Purohits is really what Sanskrit has been reduced to. But that entire rich body of thought, and how do you blend that pre-existing thought into a modern construct, is something which has been lost. So to that extent, I can well understand why a large number of people feel that, you know, the trendy thing to do is to be attracted to left thought. But on the other hand, what has also happened is that non-leftist thought has also been thrown out of the window. I mean, take the case of how the study of history has been devastatingly sort of distorted. The idea of the empirical study has been replaced almost entirely by theoretical constructs. Nobody goes to the archives anymore, they construct theories. The other day, I remember when India, when we were celebrating the 50 years of Indian independence in 1997, I was asked to make a list, to make an entire book on the 50 most famous Indians of that period. And I put out a list, and then we got these lists vetted by experts and all that. One of the famous historians of JNU objected very strongly to the inclusion of Sir Jadunath Sharma, because I regard him as one of the most sterling and pioneering historians who based his entire thing on a certain type of rigor. And that rigor was not theoretical. It was based on an accurate study of the old Marathi texts, of Persian. And so that methodology has been completely taken away. I mean, I don't think Gibbon can be sufficiently replaced by Marx. I think you need to read that. And similarly, if you want to read old classical Socrates or Aristotle, that has to be there. That has far greater relevance than postmodernism.
Yeah. So, sir, this will be the last question that I'll be asking, and I will hand it over.
How long are you going to continue? I'm just
15, 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Okay. Yeah. So this is about the recent controversy that happened with the book on Delhi riots, where one of the BJP leaders was invited as a chief guest, and the book was taken down by the publishers after the Liberals campaigned against it. So do you think it was a self-goal on the side of the Liberal themselves? And a blanket ban of a book is rather not accepted, rather a book should be an answer for a book. What's your entire take on the entire issue?
Firstly, I have some problems about these quickies which come out. You know, it's only about 3 months after the event, when you write out these books, you're bound to have a polemical exercise. It's inevitable. There are people who've written these books on Shaheen Bagh and all that sort of thing. These are quickies. Yeah. They last a little while and they disappear without trace. But yet they do manage, from a commercial point of view, they manage to capture a market momentarily. Now, this was precisely such a book. It had been screened by the publishers who were more interested in getting a quick market on that. Now, I'm not sure either a book on Shaheen Bagh or a book on Delhi riots will stand the scrutiny of time or subsequent information which will come in its way. But that is not the issue. The point is the publisher accepts it, they should publish it. If someone believes it is defamatory, then you can have a case against it. I don't think the accusations were that they were in any way defamatory. The accusations against this book was that in the launch party there was a politician who nobody liked, they didn't like, and number two, the publisher was Bloomsbury India. Now, Bloomsbury India is an Indian subsidiary of a rather important international imprint, publishing house, which has a very formidable reputation all over. Now, they felt that by Bloomsbury India publishing this book, you are giving legitimacy to a particular point of view which they feel has no legitimacy whatsoever. So the first point they believed was that that's a position that legitimacy, they are the custodians, they are the gatekeepers of who should be given legitimacy and who should not be given legitimacy. And Bloomsbury, in its own peculiar and a blundering sort of way, challenged that notion. And so the entire weight of the literary establishment, which is by and large what can be called secular, liberal, lefty, whatever, use whatever term you want, the beautiful people as I call them, they just sort of came down with a heavy hand on Bloomsbury and said, look, you're a respectable publisher. You host parties at JLF. How can you publish such a book? You can't. It's like a betrayal. It's letting the side down. So for them, it was a class action. And they'd allowed the barbarians to enter the gates. So it was that sort of a reaction which taken. I believe it was a self-goal because, the book would have come out. Some people would have read it. A lot of people would have ignored it. But these, as I said, these quickies are sort of 7-day wonders. It's not really. But instead, you've actually given a huge gamut. And you've actually focused attention, what I call focused attention on the fundamental illiberalism of the Indian liberals. And this is part of that whole international cancel culture, the woke culture, which is so off-putting and so, offensive to any ideas, which can be any ideas of free expression, etc., which are there in the world.
Yeah. So, Tamoghna, can you unmute Sharan? He has a question.
I think I've unmuted myself. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah.
Okay. Pranam Dr. Dasgupta. My name is Sharan, and I'm a research scholar specializing in South Asian studies at the Department of Geopolitics at Manipal University. I'm actually a journalist by profession, and I write on politics and foreign affairs for different national and regional media houses. Dr. Dasgupta, at the very outset, let me begin by thanking my friend for helping me curate these questions. Mine is of the life. Sir, I'm a huge admirer of your work. Growing up, I regularly enjoyed your writings along with the likes of Mr. Vinod Mehta, M.J. Akbar, Kushwant Singh, Shekhar Gupta, to name a few. What I really liked about the editors that I mentioned is the candidness with which the writings would touch the mind and soul. So it wasn't very surprising to see journalists and lawyers eventually venturing into politics at later stages of their lives, but not many of them have actually had a smooth transition, since politics always comes with a certain ideological baggage of its own, In one way or the other, everyone has a chip on their shoulder, but you seem to have shrugged all those obstacles away. What has been so different in your case?
Well, I don't know how much I am in politics or on the fringes of politics. That's an issue which I think a lot of people think that you're never in politics unless you get beaten up, unless you get arrested, and unless you have certain cases slapped on you. I must confess I haven't had those luxuries on me. So some people think I'm still an outsider in the world of politics. But look, I've always felt that really politics is all about ideas. it's really a battle of ideas ultimately. And that's what makes politics very exciting. It's often tempered by having to meet individuals and people of very, very different backgrounds. You know, one of the greatest learning experiences I can think of is that one, it's given you a fantastic insight into how the process of governance, with all its pluses and minuses, is all about. But more than that, I think in terms of actually trying to understand people, you know, that sometimes as journalists, you make rather facile and rather simplistic conclusions. This should be done. And you don't often look at it as in terms of what is possible to be done and why some people break at a particular point. So those different sort of social pressures, those different human impulses, which often intrude into the political scene, is often not seen by taking a ringside view. It's only felt when you get into the actual ring itself. When you're in the arena itself, when you're in the boxing ring, then you can feel the punches and then you also know what it's all about. Outside the ring, it looks a bit different. So that's one of the biggest sort of learning experiences which are there. The other thing is, which I've learned in politics, you don't have to respond to everything. Social media throughout the world is a cesspit, a sewer pit. I don't know, you can call it. It's like an open drain at times. The amount of abuse, the amount of things which are there, which people try to contract complex ideas into 140 words without even the necessary vocabulary, sometimes is quite irritating. But the idea is don't sort of respond to everything, take everything in your stride, but more important is try and get the pulse. From there, if someone is abusing you, never mind what language they're using, just get to the core of it. So I personally found this journey into political life quite rewarding. I don't know if the initiation rites have been so choppy. I feel it will get a little more choppier as the elections in West Bengal approach, and I think that will be a more turbulent ride than I've experienced so far. But that's something which we await in the post-COVID world.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Dasgupta, coupled with the ideas of classical liberalism, perhaps one of the first attempts in politics, as you mentioned earlier, was made by the Swatantra Party, led by Rajaji, to contest elections from a party that associated, at least loosely itself, with the conservative economic ideas back in the time. So in a country where excessive socialism was witnessed and had been a tested model for electoral success to a certain extent, a new ideological offering was made to the citizens to choose from. The conservative right in India, therefore, is a very complex mixture of a civilizational identity and constitutional morality and a little bit of free market economics. So keeping these things in mind and looking at the pandemic on how it has taken an economic toll on India, sir, do you think the post-COVID electoral scenario will turn fiscally conservative as political parties will refrain from populist subsidies in politics owing to cash crunches, especially in the case of West Bengal, like we've seen earlier?
Well, I think a lot of the answer to this question will depend on how, when people come out of the pandemic, how they view the entire experience, what they attribute the pandemic to. That the losses which have fallen in the GDP, the sort of having to tighten their belts, the same assumptions on how they would move forward in the world has been curtailed, travel has been curtailed. The whole sort of your social world has been redefined, your social and professional world has been redefined to a very large extent. Opportunities are going to be a little more limited. What people had been proceeding on certain assumptions, that was going to be. So that's, I believe that now the question is, how will people digest this? And that I don't think I have an answer to that at present. It's how people accept this. It's been such a monumental thing. It's like, how do people in history digest a defeat? And in one sense, the pandemic has been a huge worldwide defeat for the whole world, global community, if you really look at it in that way. How do they digest it? And this will often, firstly, will there be a degree of realism? Or will the entire blame for the pandemic be pinned on, they will try to find a scapegoat, whether it's China, whether it's politicians, or whether it could be anybody. Now, these are things which we don't know the answers to. I believe that for the moment, what we are likely to see is the tempering of people's individual expectations. The same degree of optimism and which marked life prior to the pandemic is going to be subdued. It's going to be far more subdued. People are going to be more cautious. People are going to be less extrovertish. They will spend less. They will expect less from society till things move on to an even keel. Now, how will that manifest itself politically? I don't know, because often you can make certain assumptions which go widely wrong when it comes to the thing. But this is something, this is the way in which it's going to work. So it's going to be monitored. I seriously don't know how the popular reaction is going to go, not immediately, but in terms of the next 2, 3, 4 years, when we begin the process of rebuilding. But of course, if the pandemic lasts, beyond next year, for instance, I mean, God forbid, then God knows, what's going to be the level of endurance as far as people are concerned. And will it be a couldn't care less attitude, people survival of the fittest attitude, what have you? So, well, it's a very interesting question, but I'm afraid that at present there's no real answer to the thing. We can only explore possible routes in which public opinion and people's minds may travel.
Right. I actually had a couple of more questions, but I would like to yield my time to the audience since there's a paucity right now. But anyway, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Dasgupta.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we just go to the audience questions, sir. The first question is by Anubhav Chakraborty. He asked, on the point of culture, do you think the Indian conservatives have failed to establish a cultural hegemony and the opposing side has successfully marched through the institutions?
You are both right and wrong. Yes, it is true that in terms of the institutions are concerned, the left, or what might be called the liberal left, has certainly has a stranglehold over the citadels of what might be called intellectual power. It's true. There's no questioning that. And that's what half the issues are. But if you talk about cultural hegemony in terms of who rules common sense, then you'll find that it's not that. When you go to a cricket match and you find a one-day match where, people get very, very exuberant and very excited, you'll find it's always India winning, you'll have Bharat Mata ki jai. It's always. So however much you might try to mold people's sensibilities in some other direction, it will always be Bharat Mata Ki Jai. But when it comes to who controls the university, you will find it's the left who controls the university. So this schism between what is common sense, what is popular wisdom, and what is the control of the institutions. And one of the reasons why there is a lot of tension in certain parts of the political world today is because a large number of those who had been accustomed to being on the pivotal seat of power, not elected power, but unelected power, by their control of the institutions, today find themselves gradually eased out of relevance. And that protest which marks that is really what explains things like award whoopsie and things like that, and constantly, and why there is such a huge difference between how India gets treated negatively in the international media and how Indians feel. And how, for example, one of the reasons why the foreign media can never understand why, despite this sharp decline in the GDP, there is no tempering, there is no fall in the level of Indian optimism about its future. Why there is this mismatch? And I think this is something which we should take into account. That again here, control over the institution, eroding control, resistance which they come from there, and what is called common sense, and how that asserts itself in one way.
So the next question is from Harshita Swaminathan. She asks, how can a collectivist society where the power is in the hands of community thought which has historically oppressed minorities like the LGBTQ community be fair to such minorities? Thank you.
Well, I'm not so sure that it's been a historical oppression of all sexual minorities. There's always been a place for them in society. But I think what's important to realize is that any human emotion, social attitudes are never static. Women were looked upon in one way, and I think we can document it. In Vedic society, they had a certain role. In medieval society, that role became more tempered and more they retreated in behind sort of closed doors. How subsequently in the 20th century there's been a greater degree of women's assertion, etc. So no social attitudes are ever static. And I think that's also the case as far as the attitude towards what is loosely called the LGBT community. Although I think in India, most of it's really the L and the G which are really on top of people's minds. And that recognition, the decriminalization of it, found, apart from a few politicians belonging to the Samajwadi Party in Uttar Pradesh who have very strong objections to it, there's been no real objection to decriminalizing. And my own feeling is that there is still a problem. There is still an issue, which is why you had to get recognition of rights done through the courts rather than through parliament. I would have preferred it had come through parliament. It gives a particular stamp of authority to it. Unfortunately, it came via the courts. So yes, you're right, there is a problem, but these are problems which will have to be tackled. But as I said, social attitudes are never static, and they evolve with time. And you don't throw out a society, you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't throw out, discard an entire society based on the fact that there are certain warps which still mark it.
Yeah. So the next question, sir, is from Srijit Datta. He says, sir, would you say that the political Hindu had lost its political character with the defeat of the Sikh and the Marathas at the hand of the British, and had resurfaced for a brief period during the Swadeshi movement in the first decade of the last century in Bengal.
Well, you're absolutely right in saying that the Marathas, one of the interesting things about Shivaji, why is he considered such a great Hindu icon, is that Shivaji didn't crown himself the king of the Deccan. Shivaji crowned himself the king of the Hindus when he was crowned. And his attempt, the later idea of Hindu Padshai, which the Peshwas took up, not very successfully, I might add, were all built towards creating a certain Hindu political community. Absolutely right. You're absolutely right on that count. As was the Sikh, when the transition to the Khalsa took place under Guru Gobind Singh, and they became what might be called the sword arm of Hinduism. The right of the Kashmiri Pandits to wear their janeu, which was one of the reasons why the Sikhs came to the forefront. Now, I don't think the Swadeshi movement really re-established the political Hindu, but it re-established the importance of the political Hindu as far as the thought process was concerned. I think to a very large extent, the political Hindu was also a factor in the Congress movement. The Congress never acknowledged it explicitly, but behind Mahatma Gandhi, there was also the political Hindu. It's very interesting if you read the large number of historical studies which have been published in the past 20, 25 years on the different levels of politics. There is a politics which existed at a sort of pan-Indian level, where it was marked by the Congress Working Committee, Nehru, Rajendra Prasad, Subhash Bose, etc., etc. The machinations therein, their engagement with the British and their attempts to secure independence, the very complex constitutional questions which also arose. But there is also the research which has been done on the mobilization right at the bottom strata. How was it mobilized? And there you will find that the Hindu idiom, the idea of Hindu nationalism was never really absent. It was the symbolism, the imagery, etc., all explicitly Hindu. And even Mahatma Gandhi was regarded in every way as a big Hindu leader. To that extent, Jinnah wasn't wrong. He was the foremost Hindu leader. He combined not only a political appeal, he had an ethical appeal. He had a moral appeal. So the idea of the Hindu mobilization was also very much present. I think it was in after independence where it went to a backseat. And naturally, as happens, it resurfaces. Because an idea which is so natural in Indian society cannot be kept suppressed for too long. The other point is not that the political Hindu exists, but whether the political Hindu can get the firm direction it needs. It's no point just having a political Hindu which is sort of rudderless, which doesn't have a moral and political compass to guide it. I think they need that. That's where the notion of leadership, that's where comes in.
The two last questions. Quickly.
Okay, quick.
So we have already closed the chat, sir. We have already closed the chat. Just the questions that we have got, sir.
Yes.
Okay.
So the question is by Nilanjana. She asks, sir, how much the concept of fanatical nationalism holds relevance to the idea of conservatism?
Well, a conservative by definition is never a fanatic. Far more subdued, far more considered, has a more sense of a great deal of stability, which is inherent in a conservative. It's more considered. So temperamentally, a conservative can never be a fanatic. But as I said, that there are strands which move in the direction of radical thought. And that's where fanatical beliefs, the huge degree of intolerance, the unwillingness to accommodate, those come into play. That's what creates. So I would say there is a temperamentally and by impulse, a conservative and a fanatic are two different creatures.
So the last audience question is from Sarbaji. He has asked two questions. I'll just ask one of them. Historically, what has been the economic outlook of a conservative? What should that be in the context of Indians?
Well, as I pointed out right in the beginning of my presentation, that there is no one view of looking at economics. And I think this is as true for the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom as it is true for the Bharatiya Janata Party in India. There are different, there are no sort of prescriptive approaches. By and large, they believe in a deregulated society. By and large. But the quantum of deregulation is something which is the point of negotiation. And that is where you have very different approaches. Now, the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom was for a brief period a party of extreme free market under Margaret Thatcher. But it was in reaction to certain circumstances, an overdose of statism. To correct that, she went in for that. But today, if you look at it, it's far more middle of the road approach. In a world which is less inclined towards statist solutions. Likewise, you'll find that in India, statist solutions sometimes may be the approach immediately after a pandemic. Because then you need certain very strong forces of intervention to raise certain things. And that may well be what happened. Does that necessarily make the BJP? In my mind, it's not. Like the Congress went in after 1991 for a great deal of market deregulation. But did it change the impulses of the Congress? Only in a marginal sort of way. It did, but it only in a marginal sort of way. By and large, the statist impulses of the Congress remained. So it's really between those two. And as far as if you look at it in classical conservative literature, you will not find too many conservative thinkers devoting too much time on whether the Laffer curve should be the guiding principle of taxation or not. Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, these Austrian and the Austrian school were the ones who brought in that, and they saw that as an antidote to the type of communism which had been there under Stalin and the Iron Curtain. Because when Hayek said that there's no difference between Hitler and Stalin, and this is really the road to serfdom, he was reacting to particular situations. And you must keep the context in mind. But conservatives often find that people like Hayek or subsequently people of the so-called Chicago school to be extreme radicals. So economics is an area which hitherto has been largely unaffected. I won't say untouched, but largely unaffected by this larger debate on conservatism. Maybe I think in due course, I think economics should enter this sphere. But as of now, it hasn't in any meaningful way. Thank you.
So before I let you go, just one thing that I wanted to end with. So from being at a managerial position at Calcutta Chemical Company to a researcher in South Asian politics at Oxford, you came a long way. Then you came back to India to working, being the editor at the Times of India, the Statesman, and now you're an MP. To sum up your journey, and if you want to give out a message to all our viewers who are there, whom I would like to thank for joining us tonight, one message that you would like to give to our viewers.
Well, partly because I think I chose my own path, and I think by the path chose, you found your own course. Sometimes life is never a series of prearranged plans. It just works out the way you do. But at the end of the day, it's your interest and your, it's how you, what you're happiest with, which often dictates your course. I mean, I took grave risks in my life. I'm not, I think when I was young, and the fact that I had a passion for history was regarded as absolute heresy as far as most of my parents were concerned, who thought that, how can a person who claims to be reasonably intelligent not study sciences? So it's your choice at the end of the day. If you've got that sort of determination to make a reasonable success, and I think at the end of the day, I can say at least I've had a reasonably exciting life. I hope there's some more left in it unless COVID intervenes. I hope that, that's really the thing. You have to take a little bit of chance here and there and go along with a combination of the heart and the head. That's really all I can say.
Sir, before ending it, as you have asking us to take chances and you have taken a lot of risks, we're hearing a lot of hush-hush around here, and I'd like to end this what I started asking you. Is Swapan Dasgupta eyeing for the Chief Minister's seat in Bengal?
I mean, hang on. There's a lovely bit of speculative journalism which is going on, which, I'm very flattered that they consider me as a possible, I'm extremely flattered that that's being talked about. But there is a degree of realism we have to talk about. And that's firstly, you've got a very tough election to fight. And I think there's a saying in Bengal, gache kathal gopete. Or rather in English, what they say, counting the chickens before they're hatched. So let's see what happens. As of now, I'm looking forward to a very, very exciting 6-7 months of electioneering in West Bengal. And I don't know how this COVID situation, it's the biggest worry of how that's going to affect everything. That's the biggest imponderable, because that's something which is beyond politics. And we really don't know. I mean, that's something which is really whistling in the dark. How is that going to affect everything? So let's hope. Anyway, it's exciting times, and I think no. The answer to that is no. I think I'm very flattered that people have thought of me as someone who deserves to get a leg up, but I think that's not the choice in dialogue.
There's another Bengali phrase, Ulobhoni Mukto Charano, for a lot of people who has been your critics over the time, and we have seen, and they have failed over the times as well. They have predicted things with your Rajya Sabha nomination as well. So we can expect you to be over here in Bengal.
Look, I think that a lot of my friends all over India often say, we've never come across a right-wing Bengali. In the old days, that's what they used to say.
Your DP is Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, by the way.
I don't know what my DP is because I didn't create it. But if it is, then I'd make it into a bit of Edmund Burke also could have fitted into that thing. I mean, there are some Hollywood stars also who also could fit in. Well, the Marx Brothers also. So look, my tastes are extremely eclectic. I consider myself a cosmopolitan in various ways. But I consider myself also a very quintessential Bong in being a bit nuts. All Bongs are a bit nuts.
In that note, sir, thank you so much, sir, for taking your time. I know we have exceeded the time limit. And
thank you very much.
It was a
most enjoyable conversation. And thank you very much. And I hope you continue to be honest critiques of everything possible.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.